Welcome to eDiscovery Leaders Live, where I get the chance to chat with luminaries in eDiscovery and related areas.
Welcome to eDiscovery Leaders Live, hosted by ACEDS and sponsored by Reveal. I am George Socha, Senior Vice President of Brand Awareness at Reveal. Each Friday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern, I host an episode of eDiscovery Leaders Live where I get the chance to chat with luminaries in eDiscovery and related areas. Past episodes are available on the Reveal website. Go to revealdata.com, select resources, then select eDiscovery Leaders Live. My guest this week is Chris Chapman. Chris is Director of Litigation Support at Dickinson Wright. He has held various roles in the eDiscovery world over the years, as a VP shareholder and General Counsel at Exact Data Discovery, an independent consultant focusing on document review, an attorney with his own firm, and an associate at another firm. He has a bachelor's degree from Texas A&M and a JD from Baylor Law School. Chris, welcome.
Hi, George. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. I'd like to let's jump right in and talk validation and explain what in the world we're talking about there.
Yeah, so I wanted to touch on an interesting court order I ran across recently. It comes to us from the world of polyurethane manufacturing. There was a matter, an MDL matter, antitrust litigation relating to diisocyanates, and the parties in that matter were disputing whether or not. First, they disputed their search terms. What were our search terms going to be? How are we going to define our review set? And whether or not we were going to use TAR. Both parties agreed to use TAR and then launched into the process of searching their data, creating their TAR review sets, analyzing the data in their TAR tools, and then trying to validate the results of that process by providing recall calculations, your typical workflow in that kind of a matter. But there were two interesting questions that I thought were raised by the report of the special master that came out in this case, Judge Francis. And one of those was, how do you know when you're done with your TAR review, or more directly, done training the model? In this case, the defendants had done a richness sample where they calculated a 3% level of richness within the data set. It was a large data set, low richness. And that told them they expected to find around 3,000 responsive documents. So the approach they took in determining when they were done training the model was, we want to hit a 70% recall target. So we need to find 2,100 responsive documents. And once we do, we're done. That, in my mind, that's a first misstep. That's a little aggressive. Doesn't allow for a lot of variables in what you're going to find in that data set, what might be out there in terms of responsive documents, whether the model has found them all. Have you identified responsive content that was different than what may have been in that richness sample, some that may have been unexpected, that maybe when you went into the matter, you weren't expecting this material to be in your data set, but it was, and there's more of it than you thought. So when you train the model, it finds a lot of it. There's just so many variables in that process. So what I think would be a better approach, there's multiple approaches you can take. And I like to kind of layer them when I'm working on a complex matter like this. I think you can do, rather than just a straight up richness sample, you could make a control set. and conduct a review of that matter. And that allows you to get more insight into your progress. So rather than just looking for a number, 2,100 documents that you found, you can monitor your recall, your precision, and see how the model is performing as you work through training it. And once you start seeing your recall approach the levels you're looking for, that gives you a better indication than just the raw number of how many responsive documents you found as to your progress.
So is that and I'm always uncertain as to how helpful this terminology even really is. Is that a TAR 1 approach, a TAR 2 approach, a TAR, 1.5 approach? Well, what are we looking at?
I think 1.5 is a good place to put it. Typically the control set was something you did in the TAR 1.0 workflow, but I do think it can give you good insight into what's in your data set and how your model is capturing it within any workflow using a TAR algorithm. So it's just another way to get insight into how your training is progressing. Not necessarily something you should rely on entirely, but it gives you some insight. And then another place you can look for additional insight as to your progress, which is what the court keyed on here, is your progress within a prioritized review. So if you're using continuous active learning and you're going through the documents in an iterative fashion based on relevance and the model's idea of relevance, and it's feeding those documents to you top down, once you start seeing less and less responsive material, that gives you a good idea of how far you've gotten and how much more may be out there. I think that's obviously a good way to monitor your progress in a prioritized review, but not everyone conducts active learning reviews in a prioritized fashion. Some people are prioritizing search hits. Some people are prioritizing custodians for rolling production purposes. Some people are doing a straight up, based on ranking prioritization. And none of those approaches are wrong. Some may be a good fit for one case and may not be for another. Another thing you can...
So in this case, then they started, as you've explained it, they started with a richness number of 3%, roughly, right?
Yeah.
That's an estimation, isn't it?
It is.
Right.
And there's a margin of error associated with that.
But that 70% target, that was a hard target, right?
Yes.
So how do you get from an estimation of 3% to a hard target of 70%?
Yeah, the 70% target was kind of an arbitrary decision as to what would be good enough. And the parties generally agreed that would be good enough. They didn't agree on how they were going to calculate that 70%.
Well, why would they? So before we get to how to calculate, why would parties agree on a hard 70% before, and I assume this is the case, before they even looked at any data?
Yeah, I am with you in that I don't think they should. I think that anytime you set hard targets like that, whether it's a hard recall target, whether it's you say you're going to hit a certain illusion target, or whether you say you're going to in your last two batches of prioritized review find less than 5% responsive documents, none of those things are really you're just predicting and guessing as to what your data set's going to look like. You can really push yourself in a corner if you're trying to hit a target like that and you have a data set that just does not lend itself to that. And the concept of proportionality should drive your decisions as to what recall is good enough and what illusion rate is good enough based on what you find in the data after you start. And if you find that to get it from 65% to 70%, you're going to have to review another 400,000 documents, and the case doesn't warrant that. Then that's the important information, not that initial target you set before you had that insight.
So before we continue with what happened in this particular matter, what do you think a more effective protocol might have been than this 3%, 70% approach that was at least suggested?
I think agreeing on what calculations you're going to use to assess the effectiveness of your training and what metrics you're going to share at the end of the process, I think that's what you put into your protocol, and make sure both sides agree on that. This is what we're going to do, and this is what we're going to get out of the process at the end, rather than looking for a target of 70% recall. You just need to be transparent about how did you structure the TAR review in terms of what data went into TAR and what didn't. What were you doing in terms of training the model? Were you using a prioritized review? Were you batching by custodian? What were you random sampling from across the whole population? Like, how did you train the model? What did you use to calculate recall? What data set was that run on? Was it a control set, as I suggested earlier, or was it just an illusion sample, or some combination of those things? Or, in this case, they talked about possibly incorporating reviewed data that was both positive examples and negative examples, responsive and non-responsive, as well as data that was just entirely excluded from the TAR process because it didn't hit on any search terms, and combining all of that into one recall calculation, which I don't think is a good way to go, but it was an interesting idea.
You mentioned transparent, and that's a term frequently used. I think often, at least from my perspective, without transparency into the definition of transparency, if you will. I mean, by transparent, do we mean crystal? You're looking through a crystal clear window? Are we looking through a largely opaque one? Have we got a largely opaque window with one small section that's been wiped clear so you can see through that? What are we talking about with transparency?
Yeah, it's probably not a Webster's definition of transparency, but I do think just generally, being open about the process, the workflow, and what metrics you're expected to provide and how you derived those metrics. I think just talking TAR, not any other component of the discovery process, but just talking TAR, I think that in my mind, that's enough. I think that gives everyone what they need to make an assessment as to whether this process worked and how thorough and complete it was with regard to the training of the TAR model.
So I've sidetracked you here. You barely got into a discussion of this case. Where were you going to go next with it?
So in discussing, I'll jump back to how do you know you're done training the model. So we talked about looking not just at your progress in the prioritized queue and what kind of data you're finding in terms of it's not just is it relevant, but how relevant is it towards the end of your training process. We talked about possibly using a control set and monitoring your progress in terms of your recall calculation that way. Another thing you should look at is the rank distribution. It's a very good snapshot at any given time.
By that you mean
across the entire data set, where are your documents ranked? Do you have a lot of documents ranked in the middle, closer to 50? Or is everything pushed out, 70 and above and 40 and below or 30 and below? What does that rank distribution look like? Is it a beautiful U shape that we often look for, or is it something else? And if it's something else, why is it something else? And is there anything else we can do in terms of our training process to improve that? But you can often look at that rank distribution and see that you have a pocket of documents, whether it's you have a real problem if you have a large swath of documents that are ranked between 50 and 55, but you may also have a problem if you have a lot of stuff ranked 40 to 50, and there's a spike there. So it just gives you a good insight into what's out there, and are there any sets of documents you need to focus on a little more and maybe sample from a little more, rather than just what the model is telling you is likely relevant. The more insight the model has into those pockets of documents, the more likely it is that it'll push those one way or the other in the rankings, and you'll have a better rank distribution and a more clear result.
That a hugely and perhaps ridiculously oversimplify. If we were thinking of this whole process as a wind-up car, too often I think you're suggesting people wind up the car, set it on the floor. The front wheels and the back wheels are both locked in terms of the direction, so it just goes wherever you start it, and it might veer off, but you can't do anything about that, as opposed to a wind-up car where you've also got a remote control so you can steer it as it goes. And
Exactly.
suggesting an approach that would be much more akin to the latter, right?
Exactly. And as long as you are sampling from the whole data set that's part of your TAR analysis, you can be pretty comfortable that the results you're getting from it are improving the model. Too often when you're focused on just a prioritized review, you may or may not be getting good insight into what exists in the documents that are ranked below your relevance cutoff, or at least where you're at in terms of working through your relevant documents. And often, if you take that approach, you don't find out that that's a problem until you are doing an illusion test, and that's where you don't.
That's not done until the very end of the process.
Exactly, right? And that's where you don't want to be. You don't want to be where you think you're done. If you've had reviewers engaged on this matter and they're no longer working because you think you're done, you have a whole host of problems in terms of not just the potential discovery fight with the other side on trying to validate your process, but do you still have the resources in place to complete the review? How many more documents are you going to have to review in order to get it back on track? What's your timeline allow for in terms of getting those steps done? So having insight into those things throughout the process via a control set and via keeping a close eye on your rank distribution and more thorough sampling from across the population, you can control a lot of these factors.
So if we go back to the old phrase of trust but verify, you'd be doing a lot of verifying along the way, not just at the end.
Yeah, a lot less trusting, a lot more verifying.
Anything else on this particular decision that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, one thing I thought was interesting was the discussion around how you validate your process. How do you calculate recall? What goes into that decision? And here, the court actually didn't really get into it too much. They discussed the plaintiff's approach, they discussed the defendant's approach, but at the end of the day, they just said, in the order, provide your recall calculation and how you derived it. Which is, I think, really all you need. But the discussion raised some interesting points in terms of, in this case, they use search terms ahead of running a TAR process, but those search terms were not agreed upon by both sides. So not only did you need to validate that your TAR model was adequately trained and was finding enough responsive material to meet your discovery obligations, you also needed to validate that the search terms you chose were reasonable and were returning, enough of the responsive content and the important responsive content to meet your discovery obligations. And the initial approach taken by the defendants didn't account for the search term piece. It just covered the training of their TAR model.
So that then goes back to your earlier point of make sure that you do a lot of verify and not just trust.
Yeah, I think, if you don't have agreement as to search terms, you need to be armed with information about, what was the richness level of the search population you did use. You did a richness sample. What was your estimated richness or prevalence within that set of data? In the set that you did not have a search hit, sample that. What are you leaving behind in that set? And particularly focus on the documents. If the other side has proposed search terms that you did not accept, what's the richness and additional burden from bringing in those documents to the process? And the court had a good point here, and the defendants raised it. Though, it sounds easy just to throw those additional documents into the TAR process and see what the TAR model says about them, rather than fighting on, do we want to add these additional 50,000 documents to our review? Well, likely, if they're you obviously think they're marginally important, and that's why you don't think they should even be included in the process. So it's likely that the TAR model will agree with you if you're right. And they'll just be cast aside. You'll never have to look at them because they'll be ranked low. The problem with that is, one, if you already have a low level of richness, that can create difficulty in attaining your recall target that you set, which we've also already acknowledged that's a problem. But if you're trying to hit that 70% recall target and you've got a 100,000 document data set that's only 3% responsive, you don't have a lot of room for error in terms of responsive documents in that illusion set. It doesn't take much to really throw off your recall calculation if you find a few hundred responsive documents. If you only have 3,000 in the whole case, that's a big blow to your recall number.
I think at this point, I'm gonna give you a choice. We could spend not just the rest of our time, but probably the rest of our day talking about various aspects and facets of this decision and what they suggest. We could shift the discussion to talk about the importance of people as part of this whole process. It's not just numbers and calculations. Which path do you want to use in our remaining time here?
Yeah, no, I think we've talked about this before. I think, we can shift gears to talk about the importance of people. And so I came into e-discovery initially, working as a contract attorney and working in the trenches of document review and kind of learning a lot about all these platforms and the electronic discovery review process that way. And seeing how the decisions made in these types of cases as to whether documents are responsive or not, whether they're privileged or not, whether they get produced or not, are made by people tagging the documents, reviewing the documents, making their assessments, and people are going to agree or disagree about a lot of things in doing that, and that really plays into the effectiveness of a TAR process. It's not just about the technology, but who's making the decisions that are training the model, and are we working to ensure that those people are equipped with the right information to make those decisions, and are we assessing the quality of their work, and how are we doing that, and ensuring that those decisions are correct. And I think in terms of a continuous active learning review, that type of algorithm is much more forgiving in terms of variances and tagging. If you have 50 attorneys reviewing documents, they might not all reach the same decision about a particular document. But if most of them do, then the model's going to see that as the likely correct answer. And it gives that gives you additional insight beyond just that tagging decision as to the likely relevance of that document. So I think we've kind of come full circle from not just using the technology to enhance the process in terms of streamlining it, reducing the volume of documents we need to lay eyes on, but also helping us assess the quality of our work in the documents we are laying eyes on. I think really can enhance the process.
And it at least early on in the use of predictive coding tar, whatever you want to call it, batch sizes were fairly large. Some platforms and some processes still continue to take that approach. Others use much smaller batch sizes, say as small as 10 documents per batch. Do you see pros and cons, one approach versus the other, especially when it comes to what you were just talking about?
Yeah, I think it really depends on how you're feeding documents into those batches. So if you're using a tool like email threading, for example, I think it's more important to have that full conversation combined into a batch than it is to look for any particular number. So having a strong reviewer work through a complex 55 document email thread and code it consistently and correctly adds more value than breaking that up across multiple reviewers. But if you're using something like prioritization and tar rankings, I think the more you can break that up into smaller sets, the faster your model is going to be trained, the more progress you're going to see in terms of its learning, the less waste you're going to have in terms of stale rankings feeding documents into batches. So there's pros and cons, but it depends on what your goals are, what you're reviewing and why, and is it more important to have like content together, or is it more important to review the least amount of documents, or is it more important to review the most likely important documents first? And there are a lot of factors that play into the decisions of how you should structure any particular review in that regard.
Often these reviews, TAR 1, TAR 2, are described almost like as a machine-like process where the reviewers are doing their piece heads down, not thinking about a bigger picture, and at least implicitly not calling someone's attention to something unusual that arises. First, is that how it actually goes? And second, whether it is or isn't, what should be happening?
So it definitely does often go like that. I always took the approach of trying to make sure the review team was cognizant of the big picture, of the goals, felt like they were more part of the case team, and kind of understanding where we were in terms of the litigation, what we were reviewing, why we were reviewing it, what we were looking for, how they can help. And I think that increases their level of engagement, and it pushes those discussions of, if there's a document that seems important, or they're not sure whether it's important, or need a deeper understanding of it. Pushing those conversations, not just between reviewers posing questions to review managers or attorneys that are supervising, but among each other, and say, hey, look what I found. What do you think about this? Here's what I think about it. I think those kinds of conversations are valuable and should happen. And if you create the right kind of review environment, and the right kind of collaborative approach with your reviewers, that's more often than not what you're going to get. And that, I think that's key to a successful review.
Well, we could obviously continue this discussion for quite some time. I think we'll stop now on a high note, with something positive to think about there. Thanks, Chris, for taking the time to talk with us today. Chris Chapman is Director of Litigation Support at Dickinson, Wright. I am George Socha. This has been eDiscovery Leaders Live, hosted by ACEDS and sponsored by Reveal. Thank you all for joining us today. We will be skipping next Friday, no surprise, the day after Thanksgiving, but we will be back when I can talk clearly again. We will be back on December 3rd with Patrick Kennedy of Paradigm. Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you, George.